Today on the minimal equipment list, we are talking about tubes. Welcome back to Skyrider Limited, everybody. My name is Jesse, and today on the minimal equipment list, the sometimes regular show where I talk about kite equipment, we're talking about the sticks in your kite. See, I got a big pile of kite framing material in front of me here. I've got a number of manufacturers and sort of the three major material groups all lined up, and we're going to kind of go through and talk about what makes each one different, and why a kite manufacturer would consider each material. And we'll talk a little bit about repairing your kites and good good practices for stuff like that. So we'll dive in with what most kites started with, and that is wood. So we are at my dining room table here, and I have a couple of pieces of wood, which are kite frame material. Mostly single line these days, but if you go far enough back, there was quite a lot of wood in sport kites at the early, sort of beginnings. And there are still people making wood frame sport kites out there. Every once in a while, we'll see Dynakites, some homebrew Dynakites framed in wood, and it works pretty good in a kite like that. So this is a round dowel here. Wood framing predominantly comes in round dowel or in some kind of box frame piece. This is a strip of balsa that you can see has been steamed into a curve. And in a sport kite, that might be done for a batten. If you remember the Banshee in one of the previous Kite Bag Tour videos, there were some steam-shaped wood battens. This is actually the spine for a fighter kite that hasn't been cut to length yet. But you get the idea from that of this sort of steam set shape. That is kind of unique property in a wood frame, is that we can set a shape in it that will be somewhat held by the material. Wood, as you'd imagine, is a fairly bouncy material. It is, or can be, kind of brittle. And especially depends on the source of wood, how much that is going to be an issue. So from there, we're going to move into the first sort of space age material that showed up in kites, fiberglass. So wood has pretty well fallen out of favor, except, like I said, in some homebrew. We still see some fiberglass, though large fiberglass tubing was largely used in early sport kites. It's kind of heavy, but it does have a really nice spring quality and a good stiffness to weight ratio. I've got three different colors of fiberglass here. So we have black rod, yellow rod. Both of these are pultruded. You can see as I point them at the camera there, they're hollow. And then I've got a solid white rod here. This is actually a factory Dynakite rod. This is a spine for a full-size Dynakite Color Master. And then the other form of fiberglass that you'll see, and we still see quite a lot of, is helical or wound rod fiberglass. That's a solid fiberglass. It sort of has a ridge running down the length of it, and we see it a lot in battens and active standoffs. Notably, the new Vented Intention had helical. The Supernovas from Benson Kites, and the battens and standoffs on like a flexifoil matrix are all helical. Actually, the HQ Diva has helical wingtip battens as well. Fiberglass is great for a lot of applications, but it can be flexier than a lot of people want. It tends to be extremely durable. As you can see, I'm sort of putting quite a lot of bend in that without breaking, which is a great quality, but it does tend to be heavier than an equal-sized piece of carbon, which I think is a great segue into what most of us are most familiar with, carbon fiber rods. So you can probably see on the table in front of me here, I have three piles of carbon laid out. What we've got here are sort of three groupings of various types. This is all tapered tubes. Here we have our straight tubes. These are both wrapped. And then over here, we have solid, pultruded, and microcarbon. Each tube is going to be, there's various sizes of tubes, different weights, flex characteristics, um, stiffness ratios, brittleness. All those are going to be a factor in choosing a stick, and all of them are going to change how a kite performs. There is no absolute recipe as to what stick you would choose for an ultralight or a standard, but there's definitely some commonality. If we're building a super ultralight, unnecessary weight is unnecessary. So a designer will probably gravitate towards smaller tubes. Let's start with the micro. Microcarbon shows up in a lot of small sport kites and is the most common material for standoffs and battens these days. It's got great flex rate, and obviously the longer the piece, the more flex you're going to see. It's made up of effectively stranded carbon fibers, and is kind of tricky to cut cleanly as a result. We'll talk more about cutting carbon and various materials later on in the video. Micro, though, is also fairly durable. It's pretty hard to break, as you probably gathered. Um, and it's also more or less the least expensive of the materials. Generally comes in 3 or 4 foot sticks, which means you can get quite a lot out of one piece, too, if you're needing to make standoffs for most kites. Here we've got a piece of pultruded. Pultruded is very stiff and sort of has good recoil. Obviously, the longer the piece is, the more recoil you're going to see. You can see that that is going to be a hollow tube, and it is made of lengthwise strands, as opposed to a wrapped tube, which we'll get to later. And then your solid material, so you can see that's a solid rod, solid bar. Again, really solid recoil properties, going to be the heaviest. Mostly we see this used for single line kites and for ferrule material. Pultruded can also be used for ferrule. For lighter kites, we may use a pultruded or hollow ferrule. Sometimes we'll actually combine these materials. So, for example, there's a stick. I don't actually have one here, but there's a stick that the exact size of ferrule isn't made anymore in carbon. But what you can do is use a hollow piece of fiberglass and then sleeve a solid piece of carbon into it to make a solid ferrule for that stick. So let's talk really quick about manufacturers in carbon. There are a bunch, but there are a lot less than there used to be. So when we go back into history, you have Avia, Sky Shark, the original Sky Shark, because there's Sky Shark competition airframes, which you can probably see the logo on that tube. And then we have later Sky Shark, like this 2PT here, which will say Sky Shark 2. And then the most recent Sky Shark, which will sometimes say something like USA or made in the USA by Sky Shark. And actually there's another recent tube with the Sky Shark 2 logo. So you have Sky Shark and Sky Shark 2. Those are evolutions of a company. Obviously, though, a related brand and more or less the same brand, though not all of the same tubes are still in production. There is Dynamic, Crystal, Mystic, and Radius, and X-Flow. Those are all coming out of China and Taiwan and places like that. They're excellent carbon. They are in a lot of kites produced in that part of the world, as well as some stuff produced in the US and Europe. And they make some really great tubes and fill some gaps that the other manufacturers don't have necessarily overlap in, which is pretty cool. I think I already mentioned Avia Sport, so Aero Stuff. Aero Stuff is still kind of considered the pinnacle of carbon. That is Japanese. And then there was another brand, Icone, that has departed us as well. You'll see Icone in some older R-Sky product and stuff like that. Let's talk about straight tubes first. So here we've got a wrapped unsanded straight tube. This specific one, this is cool. This is from one of those extinct manufacturers. This is a G-Force UL Excel spine. So most of the G-Force line from Avia were taper tubes, but this was the straight tube that was used in a lot of the spines. So why you would use a straight tube is because it's going to have a consistent flex rate across the entire tube. Within that, there's a bunch of different ways to do a wrapped tube. So this is wrapped clear. You can see some Sky Shark 2P. This is old 2P, but I believe they're still making this rod pretty much the same way. And then here we have a P100, I think. So this is a sanded tube, so you can see that change in the finish. And then the final style of wrapped straight tube we see right now are these really cool woven finish tubes. This is a P2X. Now, important to remember with these guys from Sky Shark that the X series tubes are going to be as stiff as the next number higher, but way similar to their 100 series counterpart. So a 2X is as stiff as like a P300, weighs like a 200, but most importantly, they come in 31 and a half, not the more common 32 and a half. It's important to remember that most tubes, not all, the standard length is 32 and a half inches or 82.5 centimeters. But those P2X tubes are an inch shorter. There are also 40-inch tubes or roughly 1 meter out there, much less common. Handful of kites really use those still. So with these, you're mostly going to see internal ferrules. So for example, here we have a solid carbon internal ferrule there. But occasionally, you will see an external ferrule. This is a lightweight aluminum ferrule. This rod is the center section for a super ultralight quad. So you can see it has ferrules on both ends. And they are taped on with this lightweight packing tape just to help keep the weight down. That whole frame will weigh about 40 grams, which is lighter than some of the heaviest tubes that you can put in the kite, just one tube. So it's quite a weight savings. Now on to the stuff that we all sort of see the most of, I would say, which is taper tubes. Though there is quite a lot of straight tube out there, it seems like taper tubes have the modern sport kite world pretty well in hand. There's a number of finishes and a number of taper rates, number of carbons in use. It's important to understand that not all carbon is the same. Some of the manufacturers will have trade names for their various levels of carbon. My day job is in cycling, and one of the really common brands of carbon in bikes is Toray, and they'll talk about their carbon in terms of its tonnage or modulus. Higher numbers are stiffer, which means you need less material for the same flex rate, but that can also lead to brittle construction. So whether you're building a structure out of carbon or building a kite, choosing the right tube is going to be really, a design balancing act to make sure that you have the correct properties. So again, over here we have a number of tubes from a number of manufacturers. This is some stuff from Avia again. I think there's a third one in here. Let me see if I can spot it really quick. There it is. So we've got G-Force Skinny. So this is their small diameter, big end, small diameter, small end, super flexy, ultralight indoor rod. Then you have these two, both out of the G-Force line. We have a G-Force UL and SUL. These guys all came in 40s as well, and were really common in a lot of kites in the early 2000s to 2010s and through the 90s. Fun fact, if you ever see one of these tubes with a reinforced ferrule section, it was probably meant for a prism. From there, we've got a whole bunch of various Sky Shark tubes laid out here. So I'm going to kind of resort this as we go. So here I've got a nitro light and a nitro. people will still refer to these as black diamond nitros. These are not black diamonds. They do not make the black diamonds anymore. It is interesting to note that that nitro is an unsanded tube like the Avia, that nitro light. And then here we have that nitro in the sanded finish. There's also nitro strong that will be sanded as well for the most part, though I heard a rumor that Sky Shark may be going back to unsanded tubes, which I'm kind of excited about. Here we have a 2PT, which is one of the lightest taper tubes they make. Very, very flexy. These things, not well supported, will just explode on you. So the designer has to be very careful about how they use that tube. But you can see sort of how flexy that is. And then if I pick up that nitro, which is the strongest that I have on the table, you can see how much less flex is in that. That's a function of the diameter of the tube, the thickness of the wall, the carbon used, bunch of factors there. So that brings us to these guys. So here I have two 7PTs and a 5PT, and you'll see a different logo here. And you will also see that these are shiny. These are actual black diamonds. So black diamond was a finish. It was a clear coat finish that they were putting on the tubes. And you could get black diamond in 5PT, 7PT, nitro, and nitro strong. I don't know if there were black diamond nitro lights. I'm pretty sure there weren't black diamond 3 or 2 PTs. I don't believe that there were ever black diamond straight tubes or zero air, which is probably the lightest Sky Shark tube, but also the most fragile. Definitely one to be used with caution when you are framing a kite. So now I've got a couple of the exotics here. So I mentioned crystal. So Sky Shark is no longer doing clear coat tubes, but Crystal is. We have a nice shiny clear coat Crystal Z2 here. This is the lower spreader in that new canvas Frank. This is one of the spares because shortly after I got mine while filming for Virtual Freestyle, I managed to pop a lower spreader and a sneak. Sneaks are spreader eaters, and so I do tend to keep some spares around. And that brings us to sort of the pinnacle of carbon, Aero stuff. These are really cool tubes. They are an unsanded tube. There's actually a change in construction at the ferrule end here. It's worth mentioning, by the way, on all these taper tubes, generally speaking, the ferrule end, the big end, is actually going to be straight for a section before the taper starts. How long it stays straight and how much of it is straight is going to depend on the tube designer's intentions. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute. But on these tubes, you actually have a change to the construction at each end to reinforce the fitting ends. And these tubes are actually conical up here to have as uniform a flex characteristic as possible. There are 3 models of Aero Stuff still in production. Here I have Aero Stuff Gold. This is the heaviest and strongest. This is sort of meant for your full-size kites. Common in a lot of French kites, and also Carl Robichaud likes Aero Stuff a whole lot, and we saw this back in the day with the Furies, and then this rod, as he's still producing some Fury 8.5s for folks, my Fury 8.5 is framed fully in Aero Stuff Blue S. This is your smaller kites and ultralights, and then there's a tube in the middle here called Gold S. All of my Ultims, the large Ultims, not the FX or the Antidote, are at least partially framed in Aero Stuff. The vents use Aero Stuff Gold spreaders. The standard is all Gold S, and the ultralight is all Blue S. So, now that we've gone through the different types of tubes and some of the manufacturers, let's talk about using these tubes. So let's talk about using these tubes. Kite designers, as they're choosing framing for their kite, are going to take into account a few factors like intended wind range, size of the kite, bridling style, and with all of that, will dictate where in this sea of framing parts they select. just taking a kite and reframing it won't necessarily change the wind range, but it could dramatically alter the way a kite behaves. Nowadays, balance is so important in these kites, particularly as we get into the more high performing freestyle sport kites. The more you're trying to trick the kite, the more important that balance becomes. The weight of a top spreader, where the split in a two-piece spine is, all of those things can have a dramatic effect on the way a kite behaves, and will affect those choices. An interesting anecdote, just because a tube is very light and considered easily breakable doesn't mean it can't handle high wind. For those of you who are in a lot of the Facebook groups on sport kiting, you may have seen that Lumo Kites has been testing a team kite. And he's been flying it in some fairly high wind, 25 kilometers an hour or more. And he's framed it in P90s and in P100s, and I think 3 PTs. That is what I would traditionally call an ultralight, possibly even a super ultralight frame, but he is flying it in extremely high winds for that framing. The kite is bending over quite a lot, but it's not breaking, and so a lot of this framing choice then relies on bridling, how well the bridle supports the kite, and the frame to really make that frame work. And you may be able to exceed the expected wind range for a frame, or the other way, you may be able to make a kite efficient with a more robust frame than is generally considered advisable for an ultralight. Let's talk about cutting tapered tubes for a minute. So first of all, if you break a tapered tube in the middle, you pretty much only have one choice: replace the tube. In a straight tube, in a bind, in a field repair, you can put an extra ferrule in and keep going. I still wouldn't recommend it. Once that carbon has broken, it is likely to keep breaking. And while you are also changing the balance, you may also be setting yourself up for a more catastrophic break, which could claim the sail. Taper tubes, because they are tapered, can't be ferruled in the middle because you're going to completely change the flex rate. You also don't necessarily have a ferrule that's going to fit both sides. But I did mention that a lot of tapered tubes have a straight section. So let's talk about cutting a tapered tube. Probably the most notable kite for this that it makes a significant difference in, right now, one of the open source kites, the Escape, has in its plans a lower spreader that is cut from the big end, from the ferrule end. And that is because the designer wished to keep as much flex in the tube as possible, so he wanted all of the skinny end he could have and cut down from the ferruling end. There is plenty of material there to do that. That changes the way that tube behaves in a cut down size versus a kite like my Ultims, which are cut from the small end, which are going to use that cut to stiffen that tube's response by having less taper between the big end and small end. Important note on Aero Stuff specifically, as we're talking about taper, the ferrules for Aero Stuff are tapered. And you don't actually need to glue them. And in fact, you shouldn't glue them because they're very expensive too. But they can just be wedged into the tube. And because they're conical, they'll stay put. And then if you break it, you can just yank it out of there. Sometimes you need like a rubber glove or something to get some extra grip on it. You just yank it out of there and stuff it in the other one. All Aero Stuff ferrules are hollow. A lot of people do fill that hollow ferrule with solid carbon to stiffen it and change the flex rate of the ferrule. Gluing that solid piece into the ferrule is okay, but always consult the designer before making a change like that. If you're breaking a lot of kites at the tee, it is always worth taking a look at where and how you're flying, but it is also worth talking to a designer. Most of the time, kite manufacturers will be happy to talk to you about their choices and give you some advice about their kites setup and framing. Um, so, how to cut a tube? There's a number of ways you can do it. Generally speaking, I would recommend using a carbide saw blade with carbon. There are carbon specific saw blades in the cycling industry that fit a standard size hacksaw. Just remember with those saws that they are going to take a larger bite and compensate for that with your measurements. Um, so for hand saws and people who want to work low tech, also great if you're off the grid at the flying field. Hacksaw is a great option. Um, Rechargeable rotary tools have gotten very good and very inexpensive. I have used and continue to use for mobile repairs a Dremel tool. They've started making larger quick release cutoff wheels, which are awesome for this. The larger diameter cutoff wheel gives you a lot more control because you can cut the rod without the tool interfering a lot of the times. And then for home setup, and if you're doing a lot of frames, nothing beats an arrow saw. So carbon fiber arrow shafts are where a lot of this comes from. A lot of the straight tubes may even be produced by an arrow shaft manufacturer. If you go far enough back to the early start in carbon, Easton arrow shafts were a really common framing option, as were like Beeman and some of the other extinct carbons were also arrow shafts. So an arrow saw is great. They'll have a measurement. They're designed for the length of tube. You can set the saw and just chop it. They're also small, chop saws. You can get a carbide, like a tile cutting saw blade, will work really well as well. There is a running debate to tape or not to tape where you're cutting. To be honest, I go back and forth. I will always tape if I'm doing solid pultruded or micro. With a wrap tube, I routinely don't. I cut quite a lot of carbon in my professional life as we're cutting aero bars for time trial bikes and forks for new builds. And as long as you use long enough strokes with the hacksaw or are using an appropriate blade on your Dremel or chop saw, generally speaking, I find the taping unnecessary. It is okay to file carbon, but you want to be careful about tearing strands away. Once the strands become unbound, they will begin to lose integrity. Yeah, guys, I hope this helps. There's a lot of great articles. I was just scrolling through the Kite Life archives of various magazines, and I actually stumbled across an article in one of the Stunt Kite quarterlies about picking tubes. Kite Click had an article from Sean Tinkham back in the day. Lots of tables out there with lots of information about weight to flex ratios and stuff. At the end of the day, picking a kite based on its wind range for your environment and your intended use case, and letting that manufacturer worry about what stick is in it is probably my preferred method of worrying about frames. But there is also a thriving community of people who like to experiment with their kites, and I would be remiss if I didn't say, go for it. Um, some of that is just going to be learning style and how you learn. So, like I said, I hope this primer on framing materials helps and also shows you just how many options there actually are. Um, Thank you all for liking, subscribing, sharing, and following. As always, I am Jesse, and we will see you out there, Skyrider.